In the warm, sunny seasons, we've many good reasons to get some garden work done. Planting seeds and pulling weeds, anything the gooder needs. Garden work is so much fun. Annuals, perennials, veggies and biennials. Garden work is so much fun. Hosta glades and apple trees, carrots, cukes, and fresh sweet peas. Garden work is never done.
I came over since I know that you're the expert, one of the experts in the Men's Garden Club of Minneapolis, and has been in the club for a long time. I have a problem. I'm trying to make a boulevard garden. I've got grass that isn't growing well at all, and I thought maybe I should turn it into a garden. Do you know anybody that's done this, or can you find anyone to give me some advice?
Well, I haven't done it myself. I just grow grass on my boulevard, but I know some people have done a wonderful job with it.
Oh, that sounds
And
great.
they're members of the garden club. We could go and visit them, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to tell us.
Terrific.
Mary Maynard, she's so nice. We could just pop right in on her, I think. And Margaret Hibbard, she does a different kind of garden over there in St. Paul, and I think we could learn a lot by talking to them. Let's go.
That sounds great.
Mary, it's good to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
Say, Kay and I are interested in boulevard gardens, and you've got a very fine one here, and so we thought we'd stop by and ask you, how in the world did you ever get started with the boulevard gardens, and why did you do it?
Well, it started at least in part because I had a big elm tree on the boulevard, and we lost it to Dutch elm disease about 19 years ago. And so we had to have it taken down and the stump ground out and everything, and then new soil put in where the stump had been. And at that point, I took a look at that and said, why not just dig up the rest of the kind of ugly and difficult to maintain grass on the boulevard and plant a garden there. We had on our block a couple other people who had already done some boulevard gardening, and they kind of inspired me. So we just took it from there.
So what kind of plants did you start with?
Well, I started with a combination of annuals and perennials, and over the years it's evolved so that it's almost all perennials and mostly pretty big stuff. And it's also pretty tough because boulevards are challenging. You know, the snow piles up on them, the salt or other sand and chemicals in the wintertime. You wouldn't want to put a bush or shrub on the boulevard because the snow could break it off and everything.
I'm thinking of making a boulevard garden. So are there any tips that you could give me of things that I should think of as I do it?
Yeah, think about ahead of time how you're going to water it, because it is separate from the rest of your lawn and everything, and so there might be some challenges about watering. The other thing is the current practice for boulevard gardens is to have them concave so that it collects water rather than have it mounded or convex and have water running off of it. Because there is parking allowed on our street next to the boulevard, that's a problem for people. They park there, and on the passenger side they can't figure out how to get in or out. So if I were going to do it again, I would either put some space between the curb and the start of the garden, or at least some real obvious stepping stones or ways to get through.
What do you mean by space? Do you mean bare ground or?
Well, I think people have done different things. I myself would not plant grass there because you're going to have to mow it somehow. And if you have a narrow strip, that's like a foot or something that's right on your curb, that could be a problem. I have seen people put a row of pavers or, some sort of permeable stone along the side. I think even just wood chips or mulch along the edge, just to give people something like that, or stepping stones so that they could see.
You could turn it into an asset rather than than a necessity.
Yeah, just incorporate it into your design.
And you pointed out that it should have a slightly convex shape so that so that water goes into the boulevard and not running down the street.
Yeah, and mine doesn't. Right, parts of it does, but parts of it is mounded over. And because you have to be careful about runoff and what you might, add to the storm sewer systems or into the water system.
Aren't you worried about the fertilizers you're putting in there going into the sewage system?
Well, I am worried about that. And so because of that, I don't fertilize anything on my boulevard.
Really?
Well, I'm lucky to have good soil, and so I don't put any fertilizer or any other treatments on there. It's pretty tough plants.
So you don't add compost either?
I mulch it with shredded leaves, but I
that
don't compost anything there either.
Did you come with good soil, or did you have to create good soil?
I lucked out. I started with good soil.
So what are the rest of us going to do that aren't so lucky?
Well, do something that's concave. So then you can do your soil amendments and your fertilizers and what other treatments you might need to do.
Mary, do you have any trees, or is it all perennials and annuals?
Well, I do have one black walnut, and it's not very big, but I have a sentimental attachment to black walnuts because my dad really liked them.
Is that a black walnut? We thought it was a sumac.
Well, it kind of looks like one, doesn't it? It's not very big yet, and it needs to be trimmed up. But I've been learning about black walnuts because, of course, not everything grows under black walnuts. But I have found that hostas and daylilies and obedient plant, the Physostegia, all seem to do really well under that black walnut.
Well, these are some really good pointers.
Thank you.
So can we go down and take a look, and you can point out some of these things to us?
Sure, be happy to do that.
Margaret, Kay and I were noticing that you had just a terrific garden out in front of the boulevard. So we thought we'd stop by and ask you how you got started in this. Why did you decide to start a boulevard garden?
Well, if you had looked at the edges of that garden, you'd see they were very thin grass and very big weeds. And it was a kind of a hot, dry location. But I had looked at other boulevard gardens, and I thought there was just a little bit too much junk there that didn't look good all year. So I had to think about that. I went to Duluth, and I saw a great boulevard garden in the fall. Everything was dahlias, big lavender dahlias. So I came home and I told my husband, I got enough dahlias. I'm going to put that Jessie G out there and it's going to look great. Well, he said, no, that'll look great during that blooming season when they're not falling over in the street. But my neighbors lost 2 trees and suddenly it was almost in full sun. So now we've got a location between the asphalt street and sidewalk that could take some big tropicals. So then I made a combination of my dahlias and the cannas that I'd collected and gotten from friends. I put some castor beans in, the Nicotiana sylvestris, just things that would take heat and grow big.
How did you prepare the beds, Margaret? What kind of things did you do to get ready for the garden?
So what I did to prepare the gardens was I got some good advice from a couple of people. And the best one being is you need to make it concave and you should strip off about 3 inches of soil to get rid of those weeds and that dead grass.
Why should you make it concave?
So the water doesn't run out onto the street, and so it can really collect whatever water you need. And in the last 3 years, that's been particularly important because every water you don't collect is now coming from watering.
So does it have a rain garden effect? Does it fill up a bit during the rain?
Well, since we
Catches
haven't
the
had any
runoff?
rain yet, we don't know, but in theory, that would be the practice. And with the mulch sitting on there, it's just barely concave, but I think that it would.
Do you use fertilizer out there?
I do put fertilizer out because the initial mix was what we dug out was replaced by half of the farm post from the university and half regular compost. So that was pretty rich. And then I did put in some slow release fertilizer with micronutrients. And that seems to have done the trick. I think that might deplete, but I think it's still looking good in the third year.
How do you
We do
add
too.
supplemental water?
Supplemental water, gallons per week. I can load up 25 in my cart and take it out and dump that on. But my preference is to run the soaker hose. But the soaker hose has to run for quite a long time. And because it's over the sidewalk, you can't like just leave that there day and night.
So what are the major problems you run into when you've created this garden?
I think the problem is the fact that it's very hot, and I didn't really expect what almost full sun and the heat would do. Because some of the dahlias come up and they're almost like succulents. They have much thicker leaves, but then they grow more slowly and they get sturdier stalks, so that isn't bad. But I think because of the heat, if you do this location, you need to consider heat-tolerant plants. There were a few things that were planted the first year that just didn't grow very well.
What were
And
those?
well, I have a 30-inch tall red salvia that does well in the garden in general conditions, and it was a transplant, but it just didn't grow. And then I put in some things that were just too small. You know, there was the big dramatic stuff, but then I grew a little jewels of opar, and that was too small.
You just lost, you couldn't see it, or
Right.
it didn't grow well?
No, that grew fine. That was pretty succulent. It grew, but it would just sit there like a little mouse next to a group of elephants.
What about any chemicals from the road in winter that the transportation department might put on? Have you noticed any problems there?
Well, I haven't noticed problems because the garden is relatively new. But what I should do is be covering it in the winter, because everything in that garden, there are no perennials, everything is removed. And then I should just cover that up, and then in the spring just flip off the salt and sand.
spring, and we're at the perennial and trial gardens at the Men's Garden Club of Minneapolis maintains. And I'm here with Roger Seefeld, who is one of the prime movers of the team that manages this garden. Roger, this is the first work day. Can you give us some idea of what sort of things the club is doing today?
Right. This year we're doing a general spring cleanup. Some years gardeners prefer to do a cleanup in the fall, but we're approaching a lot of it this spring. And it's pretty simple what we're out after this morning. We're doing haircuts and cleanups, removing dead flower heads and things like that, just making it easier for the plants to grow in the springtime.
So I noticed when we were looking around, we have a lot of leaves on areas. What sort of thing does the club do with all these leaves?
We like to use mulch, and we found from experience that over time, the more mulch that we can get into our display areas, the better that it is for the plants. And the mulch is doing two things, actually maybe even three at least. It looks better than to just have bare dirt.
Yeah.
It acts as a weed block. The more mulch you have on, the harder it is for weeds to grow through that. And it also helps with moisture retention to keep moisture in the ground instead of having all that moisture go away when you have a windy day or a hot day that's just baking it out of the ground.
And we have some challenges here, don't we, with water? We don't have irrigation everywhere, so you have some approaches for that too, don't you?
We have a whole variety of conditions from sun to shade and richer soil with moisture in it and more dried out soil. So one thing that we have to do as we add plants to a display area is be kind of selective in picking plants that are good for the area as opposed to just something that we like or something that we think would look good in a certain area. So we pick plants that can take a little bit more neglect and put them in a sunny area, shade plants in the shade and so on, and then add mulch to help their chances of survival.
Are there any particular challenges for gardening in a public space like this?
Well, one of it is scale. There is so much space to fill up that unlike the home gardener who buys a plant or two or a bush or two, we think sometimes in terms of zones and groupings and a color scheme or a visual design that's going in a certain direction. So we have to upgrade our thinking into larger proportions than the home gardener does at sometimes.
Yeah, I can see that it is beautiful. Now, this is very early in the season, and already there is a lot going on in this garden. There's a lot of color and everything. What's your favorite thing about this garden?
Well, I guess it's hard to limit me to just one thing that's a favorite, but many people tell me the same thing that I'm thinking now, and that is that the garden always seems to have something going on. There's some color, there's some contrast, there's some bloom. Your eye starts somewhere, but then it's carried off to another direction, and we try to work things that maybe even help people look somewhere, but then their attention is drawn to another area. So it's always nice down here, and it even seems better than what expectations would be. We're almost a month later for showiness in the garden for May 1st right now. Where we're standing right now is a good example of some of the things that we've been talking about. What the Men's Garden Club has been doing is adding plants. Sometimes we take plants that come out of trials and put them in a display area, and sometimes we selectively add new plants that would be good companion plants to something else. This zone right here really shows off with striking contrasts and colors and something going on, a lot going on, and it sort of pulls your eye across it in different directions, up and down and back and forth. The dark barberries in the black back starting to bloom are very interesting, and you've got the stark contrast underneath them with the yellow spirea, some more contrast with your blue-green and the spruce over there, and a bunch of flowers showing off in front. And your eye drifts down, and you have the heucheras for some more color contrast. and it's showing off with a large number of plants at the same time.
Welcome to our Ask the Expert segment today. Our guest today is Jerry Shannon, who is an incredibly experienced gardener. He and his wife Lee have a garden in St. Paul that comprises the inside of a city block. Now, I've noticed that you have a number of, I'm going to call them understory trees in your yard that most gardeners don't even think about, that are actually native plants. You want to talk about some of those?
And you think of a tree canopy. You've got the the low-growing shrubs. Then the next layer is that understory tree layer, and then you get your tall trees. And so these understory trees are such trees as ironwood, blue beech is another native. There's another native called bladdernut, which is native to it's native zone 4, but maybe not zone 3. In zone 4 south. And then another one is is Dirca palustris, which is leatherwood, and that's native up to the Rum River and Mille Lacs area, and it's actually the first native shrub to bloom in the spring with a little tiny bell yellow flower on it, even before the leaves come out. And then another understory tree is your witch hazel, your native witch hazel, and that's the last tree in Minnesota to bloom because it's blooming about Thanksgiving or later, and so you can extend your growing season, to maybe 9 months a year with using some of these native plants that are used to blooming, some really early and some much later.
Now, in my visits to the nurseries, I haven't seen these plants. Do you go out in the woods and dig them up, or what?
No,
how do you source them?
Well, most nurseries are carrying, like leatherwood, or not leatherwood, but like blue beech. They're carrying witch hazel. They're carrying. They're not carrying so much bladdernut, but because some of these trees that we have in our yard years ago when we first wanted to buy them, you couldn't find them anywhere in the metro area. We actually had to go to Milwaukee, to find some of these, native plants. And the excuse that the nursery gave you, well, I think they have excuses from 1 to 20, and they would say that no, they're not hardy, or we can't get them. And I would say, well, if a truck comes as far as Milwaukee, there's a highway between Milwaukee and St. Paul, Minnesota, that you can bring it a little further with your load on it.
Yeah, talking about these native understory trees like the blue beech and so forth, do they compete well against the European buckthorn that seems to has invaded that entire space in our urban forests?
I don't think anything competes well with buckthorn if it gets a hold, because that's the problem with buckthorn. It can overgrow a lot of this other, and especially the seedlings and things that are coming up of the blue beech. But when they reach full size, I don't think the buckthorn can overrun them. But when they're trying to reproduce themselves by growing new seedlings and things, I think they're more apt to have problems with buckthorns. But you just have to, in an urban lot, you just have to you can control your buckthorn. You may not be able to control it in the public parks as well, but I would think in your own property you should be able to control buckthorn.
Well, I've been talking with Jerry Shannon, who is one of the more experienced gardeners I know. He's a member of the Men's Garden Club of Minneapolis, and he's been our guest on Ask the Expert.